Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Quiet Confidence. It was an ordinary day at the airport, and the terminal was bustling with the usual energy that accompanies a crowded flight. People were anxiously glancing at their watches as the clock ticked down to the boarding time, while others lingered at the gates, staring blankly at the board overhead. The passengers ranged from seasoned travelers, who were accustomed to the rhythms of airport life, to families heading out for a vacation, their faces alight with excitement. Among the crowd of travelers, one man stood out, not because he was flamboyantly dressed or because he was surrounded by an entourage, but because there was something about his aura, something that seemed different from the average person. He wasn't carrying the usual signs of wealth. No designer suit, no luxury luggage, no shiny watches or extravagant accessories. Instead, he wore a simple black hoodie, a pair of worn jeans, and sneakers. His look was laid back, almost as if he didn't care for the superficial elements of the world around him. However, there was an undeniable presence about him, a quiet confidence that seemed to draw the eye. As he stood in the terminal, his gaze flicked over the bustling crowd, but his posture remained relaxed, his hands resting casually in his hoodie pockets. He didn't seem to be in any rush. In fact, it almost looked like he was waiting for something, but that something didn't seem to involve getting through the crowd quickly. It wasn't arrogance, it was a calm assurance that he was exactly where he needed to be. He walked toward the gate as the boarding call was made, joining the line like any other passenger. There was no special treatment, no priority access, and certainly no one around him seemed to take much notice. A flight attendant at the gate scanned his boarding pass and gestured toward the jet bridge without a second thought. She barely looked up from her tablet, too absorbed in the logistics of boarding to see the potential story walking past her. The man made his way onto the plane with the same casual air, settling into his seat without drawing attention to himself. He didn't even bother to glance at the seatbelt sign when it flashed on or fidget with the overhead compartment to stash his bag. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, assisting passengers with overhead bins and offering a final check for seatbelts. Among them was Emily, a flight attendant who had worked with the airline for nearly 3 years. She was a seasoned professional, accustomed to the ebb and flow of air travel, but she'd never encountered anyone quite like this man before. Emily had been moving quickly down the aisle, stopping occasionally to help passengers with their luggage or to remind them to buckle up. She was used to the hurried pace of the job, but she also prided herself on her ability to notice the small details, those little nuances that spoke volumes about people. When she finally reached the man in the black hoodie, she briefly paused. There was something about him that caught her attention. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, the subtle confidence that made him stand out from the crowd. But there was also something else that made her uneasy, something in the way he avoided making eye contact with her. It was as though he were trying not to draw attention to himself, but Emily wasn't one to let that slide. She did her best to mask her irritation, focusing on the task at hand. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice polite but firm. "Could I kindly ask you to take your bag down from the overhead bin? It's blocking the exit aisle." The man nodded without a word, reaching up and retrieving his bag with fluid ease. He seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, and Emily couldn't help but notice how unbothered he appeared. But she had a job to do, and so she moved on. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the cabin settled into a more relaxed atmosphere. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, preparing for the long flight ahead, while passengers settled in for what would likely be a quiet few hours. Emily glanced over the seats, taking note of any passengers who seemed uncomfortable or who might require assistance during the flight. That was when she saw it, a slight movement out of the corner of her eye. The man in the black hoodie had shifted his posture in his seat, as though something was bothering him. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about his body language seemed off. Her intuition told her that there was something not quite right about him, but she dismissed it for the moment. After all, she was just another flight attendant doing her job, and this was just another flight. People had their quirks, and some of them, like this man, didn't need to stand out in any particular way. The plane soared into the sky, and Emily continued with her duties. As the hours passed, however, the feeling in her gut grew stronger. There was something she couldn't shake about this man. It was like he was out of place, like he didn't belong here with the ordinary people on this plane. But why? Emily shook off the feeling as best she could, reminding herself that she was probably just being overly cautious. She had seen all types of passengers before, from the eccentric to the downright rude. She had dealt with people who were difficult, even borderline belligerent. But this man? He didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary, nothing worth worrying about. Or so she thought. The plane cruised through the clouds, the hum of the engines filling the cabin as passengers relaxed and the flight attendants began their rounds. Emily had almost forgotten about the man, focusing instead on the usual tasks of ensuring that everyone had everything they needed for the flight ahead. That was when the incident occurred. One of the other flight attendants, Anna, approached Emily with a note from the cockpit. It was about an issue concerning the passenger in seat 14B. A minor disruption. Nothing too concerning, just a request to make sure he was properly settled for the remainder of the flight. Anna's expression was unreadable as she handed the note to Emily. As Emily scanned the note, her brow furrowed. It seemed trivial, just a little confusion about the seating arrangements. But the name on the document caught her attention. It was the man in the black hoodie. What was going on? Why was there a note about this particular passenger? Emily made her way down the aisle, scanning the seats as she moved. The man seemed oblivious to the attention now directed his way. And then, something clicked. A sudden realization flooded her mind, one that would turn everything upside down. But it was already too late to undo her earlier actions. The plane was still soaring through the sky, and the man in seat 14B, who she had thought to be just another ordinary traveler, wasn't who she had assumed at all. Everything was about to change. As Emily stood there, staring at the seat in disbelief, she had no idea that the truth she was about to uncover would completely alter the course of this flight, and her life. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in the aisle, staring at the man in the black hoodie. The note she had just read seemed so out of place, its significance starting to dawn on her with an unsettling clarity. Her mind raced, the familiar hum of the airplane fading into the background as she tried to make sense of it all. What was this man really doing here? Why did the note specifically mention him? The more she thought about it, the more confused and anxious she became. A deep sense of unease washed over her, and her fingers tightened around the note she still clutched in her hand. She glanced at the other passengers, who were obliviously enjoying their drinks or reading their books. No one seemed to notice the internal storm brewing inside her. She was just another flight attendant, performing her usual duties, but something about this man, this passenger, had flipped a switch in her mind. She needed to understand what was going on. She looked at him again. He hadn't moved much, still sitting in his seat with his hood pulled low over his head, eyes focused out the window. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm for a regular passenger. His aura was unsettling in its simplicity, as if he didn't need to try to fit in, as if he was so detached from the mundane concerns of the world that he could exist unnoticed, blending in like a shadow in the background. She had seen his face now, more clearly than before, and there was something familiar about it. It wasn't just the impassive way he held himself, the quiet confidence that hung around him like a thick mist. No, it was more than that. Emily felt like she had seen him before. Her thoughts raced again, maybe in the news? On television? She couldn't place it, but her gut told her that this was no ordinary man. The subtle unease gnawed at her, and she couldn't let it go. Trying to calm her nerves, Emily approached him cautiously. She could feel her pulse quicken as she stood before him, knowing something was off, but unable to put it into words. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but strained. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you with anything? We've noticed some issues regarding your seating arrangement." The man turned his gaze slowly toward her. His eyes were piercing, dark, and yet they seemed devoid of emotion, as though they were windows into a mind that was far away from the ordinary world. "No, everything's fine," he replied, his voice deep, measured, and impossibly calm. It was the kind of voice that didn't raise alarm, but instead had the power to quiet everything around it. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the way he spoke didn't fit the situation. He was too collected, too calm for someone in a position like this. She instinctively opened her mouth to respond, but her thoughts were interrupted by another flight attendant, Anna, who appeared at her side. Anna's face was filled with a look of mild curiosity, but Emily couldn't tell if it was concern or simple intrigue. "I overheard," Anna said, her tone neutral. "There's an issue with that passenger in 14B?" Emily looked at her, barely able to conceal the tension in her body. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But something doesn't feel right about him. There's a note from the cockpit about him. It doesn't add up." Anna frowned slightly, raising an eyebrow. "What's it say?" Emily hesitated. She hadn't fully processed the note's implications herself. The mention of the man's name seemed like a coincidence at first, but now it was starting to seem far from random. The note had referred to the passenger in 14B as a key figure, someone of importance. Emily had assumed it was a mistake. She had brushed it off as standard airline protocol, a mix-up in documentation or some mundane request from the cockpit. But the tone of the note, the way it had been worded, it felt deliberate, as if the man in question held some kind of significance that went beyond the ordinary. She could feel her heartbeat thumping in her ears. "I don't know," Emily admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I don't think he's just another passenger. I don't know how to explain it, but there's something off. Something strange about him." Anna gave her a look, clearly perplexed. "Strange how? Are you sure it's nothing?" Emily didn't know how to articulate her growing sense of dread. How could she explain to Anna that the man she had approached earlier, the one sitting so quietly with his head down, didn't feel like anyone else on this flight? But then it hit her. She needed more information. She needed to make sure her instincts were right before doing something drastic. Taking a deep breath, Emily nodded at Anna. "Let me speak to him again, but can you stay close by, just in case?" Anna's face softened, and she gave a small nod. "Sure, I'll keep an eye on things." Emily turned back toward the man in 14B. As she walked down the aisle again, she found herself drawn to him, almost as if something was pulling her closer, urging her to look deeper. She stopped at his row, watching him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. This time, she wasn't going to let him slip by unnoticed. "Sir," she said again, her tone firmer this time, "may I ask your name?" The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't seem surprised, nor did he seem agitated. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. He was calculating, as if weighing his response with the same calm precision he had exhibited since he'd boarded the plane. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment, his voice soft but unwavering. "I don't think I can share that with you." Emily's heart skipped a beat. His answer was polite, but the way he said it sent a wave of alarm through her. Why wouldn't he share his name? Why was he being so secretive about something as simple as that? She hesitated for a moment, trying to process everything. Maybe it was a personal preference, maybe he didn't want to be bothered by unnecessary questions. But Emily had seen enough people in her job to know when something didn't sit right. She swallowed, fighting the instinct to press him further. "I understand," she said, though every fiber of her being screamed to dig deeper. "But I must insist that you follow the seating rules. I'll need you to adjust your position, as the seat next to you is reserved." The man simply nodded without another word, standing up to adjust his seat, moving so fluidly it almost seemed like he was deliberately avoiding the attention of the flight attendants around him. It wasn't that he was trying to hide, it was more as if he was determined to be as unobtrusive as possible. And in doing so, he was only making Emily's suspicion grow stronger. What was he hiding? But before she could think further, a sudden realization hit her. The cockpit had mentioned something else in the note, the name. But it wasn't the name she had assumed it to be. The man wasn't just any random passenger. He was someone big. And she had made a colossal mistake in assuming he was just another traveler. The panic hit her then. It wasn't just the strange feeling that had gnawed at her, it was the confirmation she had just received, though she hadn't known it until now. The realization came with a sinking feeling in her stomach. The name on the note from the cockpit wasn't just a coincidence. This was someone important. Someone whose name could change everything. And she, Emily, had just made the mistake of a lifetime. As the pieces began to fall into place, she suddenly realized the truth. She had kicked the man off the plane, not realizing he was the very person the airline had been instructed to treat with the utmost care and respect. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of her error settled in. Before she could turn and apologize, she saw the man glance up at her, the faintest hint of a knowing smile curling at the corners of his lips. And in that moment, Emily understood. Everything was about to change. The moment that smile crossed the man's lips, everything seemed to freeze. Emily's mind reeled as a wave of realization washed over her. It wasn't just a casual smile. No, there was something deliberate about it, almost as if he knew exactly what had just happened, as if he had been fully aware of the unfolding chain of events. In that fleeting instant, Emily could feel the gravity of her mistake hanging in the air like a dense fog. Her stomach churned with the knowledge that she had unknowingly made a disastrous error, one that could alter everything. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stood motionless, trying to reconcile the situation with the reality before her. The man was still looking at her, his eyes fixed on hers with an unsettling calmness, as if he were waiting for her to catch up to the truth. And just like that, Emily's world felt unsteady, as though the very ground beneath her had shifted. The hum of the airplane engines seemed to grow louder in her ears, almost drowning out the thoughts racing through her mind. She had heard rumors about high-profile individuals flying under the radar, millionaires and billionaires who preferred to keep a low profile, blending in with the regular passengers, unassuming and invisible. But those were just stories, whispered by colleagues during breaks, the kind of things you only heard about in passing. Never in her wildest dreams had she thought she would actually be face to face with someone like that. Emily opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to try to explain herself, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? How could she explain the mistake she had made? She had been so focused on the rules, on the procedures, on making sure everything went smoothly, that she had failed to see the bigger picture, the person sitting right in front of her. The man in the hoodie leaned back in his seat, his calm demeanor never faltering. He seemed almost relaxed, as if he had known all along how this encounter would play out. The more Emily tried to collect her thoughts, the more her mind seemed to spiral. She was a professional, trained to handle difficult situations, but this was unlike anything she had ever faced. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know who you were." He raised a hand, silencing her with a simple gesture. His calm expression never changed, but there was an undeniable sense of authority behind his eyes, something that made her pause. It was as if he were measuring her, deciding whether or not to engage with her at all. "You don't need to apologize," he said, his voice smooth and even. "It's not your fault." The words should have been comforting, but they only made her feel worse. He was being too kind, too understanding. It felt like a trap, a test, and she wasn't sure if she could pass it. Her mind was still reeling from the realization that she had unknowingly kicked a billionaire off the plane, and now, this man, this stranger, was acting like it was all just another casual interaction. I don't understand," Emily stammered, her voice shaky. "I thought you were just another passenger. The note from the cockpit, it said you were someone important. But I didn't connect the dots. I should have known." He let out a soft chuckle, the sound rich and warm, but it carried an undertone of something deeper, something that made Emily feel like she was missing an essential part of the equation. "I'm not surprised you didn't recognize me," he said, his voice low but filled with an edge of amusement. "I prefer to keep a low profile. It's more comfortable that way." But I suppose I've outstayed my welcome, haven't I? Emily's face flushed with embarrassment, and she instinctively glanced around to see if anyone else had overheard their conversation. But the other passengers were oblivious, lost in their own worlds, their conversations a distant hum. The flight attendants, Anna among them, were still performing their rounds, their eyes trained on the aisles and the various tasks they had to manage. No one seemed to notice the tension between the man in 14B and Emily. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said, her words coming out in a rush. I just wanted to make sure everyone followed the rules. But I never should have assumed you were just another passenger." "I'm sorry." The man studied her for a moment, his gaze never wavering. For a split second, Emily thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that hinted at a deeper understanding, something that went beyond the surface of the conversation they were having. It was almost as if he could see right through her, as if he knew exactly how hard she was struggling with her mistake. "It's fine," he said again, though his tone was less dismissive this time. "People make mistakes. You were just doing your job. But, you see, there's more to me than meets the eye." Emily's curiosity piqued. She wasn't sure if it was because she wanted to understand the magnitude of her blunder or if she was simply trying to figure out who he was. Either way, the question was burning inside her. Who are you?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The man looked at her, his eyes softening for the first time since their interaction began. "Let's just say I'm not who you think I am. I've spent years building a reputation, a life, that's free from the expectations and pressures of wealth. I prefer it that way. But I suppose you'll find out soon enough." Emily blinked, her mind spinning. There it was again, the aura of mystery, the unspoken layers of something far greater than she had initially realized. She could feel the weight of his words, even if they didn't make sense. There was something intangible about him, something that suggested he was not only wealthy but influential in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Before she could respond, the flight attendants began to gather near the front of the plane, signaling that it was time to prepare for the next phase of the flight. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her uniform and took a deep breath. She knew she had to leave him alone for now, to regain her composure. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to unfold. This man wasn't just some anonymous billionaire. There was a story here, his story, and she was just beginning to scratch the surface. As the rest of the flight passed, Emily found herself distracted, her thoughts continually drifting back to the man in 14B. Her mind raced with questions. Who was he? What was his story? And why had he chosen to travel under the radar, away from the luxury that his wealth could easily provide? She had always been taught to respect privacy, to do her job without prying into the lives of the passengers. But this was different. This man was different. Her curiosity gnawed at her for the remainder of the flight. She couldn't stop thinking about the strange, unspoken connection they had shared in those brief moments. Emily had been so focused on the routine of the job that she hadn't noticed the man's true nature, hadn't seen the depth beneath the surface. Now, all she could think about was how she could fix the mistake she had made, how she could apologize, how she could make things right. But as the plane began its descent, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The man in 14B was not just another passenger. He was someone whose path had crossed hers for a reason, and she knew, deep down, that this encounter would change her life in ways she could never have predicted. The descent began, the low hum of the airplane's engines softening as the plane gradually lowered itself toward its destination. Emily felt an unusual tension in her chest as she moved down the aisles, securing the overhead bins and making sure everyone was prepared for landing. It was as if the flight had taken on a different atmosphere since that pivotal moment when she had first realized who the man in seat 14B truly was. Even though the flight was nearing its end, Emily couldn't help but feel like she had entered a world she wasn't prepared for, one that had completely shifted her perception of what she thought she knew about people and the world they inhabited. Throughout the remainder of the flight, she kept her distance from the man, her mind consumed by a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and disbelief. She had been working as a flight attendant for nearly 4 years, meeting all sorts of travelers, from celebrities to business moguls, but nothing had prepared her for the realization that she had unknowingly interacted with someone who was far more than just a regular passenger. But it wasn't just his wealth or status that kept gnawing at her, there was an undercurrent of mystery about him that she couldn't shake. His quiet demeanor, his ability to blend into the crowd, his complete lack of urgency or pretense, he was a man who moved through the world as though he was both a part of it and entirely separate from it. And now, Emily found herself wondering whether this was someone she would ever fully understand or if he would always remain an enigma. As the plane finally touched down and the wheels met the tarmac, a small jolt passed through the cabin. The seatbelt signs flickered off, and the flight attendants began guiding passengers through the disembarkation process. Emily continued her duties mechanically, feeling the weight of the earlier events hanging over her, but she couldn't help but glance at the man in 14B one last time. He was standing now, gathering his things, preparing to leave the plane just like everyone else. But he wasn't like everyone else. There was a quiet grace in the way he moved, an effortless confidence in his every step. It was as though he had lived 1,000 different lives, each one more intriguing than the last. As the other passengers filtered off the plane, Emily caught a glimpse of Anna, who was standing near the exit, speaking with another flight attendant. Emily knew that Anna had been eyeing the man too, perhaps sensing the same tension in the air. She felt a flicker of relief at seeing her friend's familiar face. Anna was someone she could confide in, someone who might understand her confusion. She needed to talk to someone, to work through the bizarre feelings that had taken root in her chest. "Hey, Anna," Emily said as she approached her. "Do you know who the guy in 14B was?" Anna's eyes widened, a knowing look flickering across her face. She lowered her voice, glancing around to make sure no passengers were within earshot. "You mean the one you asked to move earlier?" Emily nodded, her unease palpable. "Yeah, the one who didn't seem bothered at all. I don't know. There was something about him. He wasn't like the other passengers." Anna looked over her shoulder at the now empty seat in 14B, as though confirming the man's absence before speaking. "That's because he's not just another passenger. He's much more than that." Emily blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Anna leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "The man you were talking to? His name is Alexander Finch. He's the CEO of Finch Enterprises." Emily stared at Anna in disbelief. "The CEO of Finch Enterprises?" But he was wearing a hoodie and sneakers. He looked like any other regular person. Anna shrugged slightly, her expression thoughtful. "That's how he prefers it. He's one of the wealthiest people in the world, but he doesn't like the attention. He doesn't want to be treated differently. He's very private, and he moves through life without making a spectacle of himself." Emily's mind raced. The name Finch Enterprises sounded vaguely familiar, but she hadn't connected it to the man in the hoodie. Finch Enterprises was a multinational conglomerate, one that owned businesses in nearly every industry imaginable, from technology to entertainment to real estate. Alexander Finch was known as a reclusive figure, a visionary entrepreneur whose wealth and influence had made him a household name, yet he rarely appeared in the media, preferring to keep his personal life out of the spotlight. Emily had heard of him before, of course, but never in a million years would she have imagined that he would be sitting in a middle seat on a commercial flight, dressed in a simple hoodie and sneakers. "So, I kicked him off the plane?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with a mix of horror and disbelief. Anna nodded slowly, her expression sympathetic. "It happens more often than you think. There are plenty of people like him, billionaires and CEOs who prefer to keep a low profile. But you were just doing your job. You didn't know who he was, and that's not something to be ashamed of." But Emily felt a rush of shame, her cheeks burning at the thought of how she had treated him. She had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume that he was just another passenger, that she hadn't even considered the possibility that he might be someone extraordinary. And now, she realized, she had missed an opportunity to make a lasting impression on a man who could very well have changed the course of her life. What happens now? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Anna gave her a reassuring smile. You apologize, of course. But don't worry, he's not the type to hold grudges. If anything, he'll probably respect you more for doing your job without any special treatment. He's got a lot of respect for people who work hard, who don't take shortcuts. Trust me. Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully believed it. She had been too quick to judge, too quick to enforce the rules without considering the context. She couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of cosmic lesson, a reminder that appearances were often deceiving, that the world wasn't always as simple as it seemed. The man she had asked to move was not just a businessman or a CEO, he was someone who had built an empire from the ground up, someone whose decisions could impact millions of lives. And yet, he had sat quietly, unnoticed, in the same seat as everyone else. He hadn't demanded special treatment, hadn't raised a fuss. He had simply gone along with the flow, content to remain invisible, even though his influence could have made him the center of attention. As the last of the passengers filed off the plane, Emily felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on her shoulders. She had been given a glimpse into a world she had never truly understood, a world of power and influence that operated on an entirely different level than the one she was used to. But she knew that, despite her mistake, this encounter wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a lesson. It had shown her the importance of humility, of looking beyond the surface, and of not letting preconceived notions shape her interactions with others. But she also knew that she couldn't leave it like this. She had to apologize. She had to make it right. And so, with a deep breath, Emily walked down the terminal, determined to find Alexander Finch, to apologize for her mistake, to tell him that she had learned from it, and perhaps, in doing so, change the trajectory of her own life. After all, how often did a flight attendant get the chance to meet a man who could change the world? As Emily made her way toward the terminal, her mind spun with a whirlwind of thoughts. The conversation with Anna echoed in her mind, each word amplifying the growing sense of urgency and dread that had settled in her chest. She needed to fix this, needed to make it right. The mistake she had made earlier was monumental, and though Anna had assured her that Alexander Finch would probably brush it off, Emily wasn't so sure. How could he? How could anyone let go of something as glaringly obvious as the fact that a flight attendant had kicked them off a plane without realizing who they were? She couldn't stop replaying that moment when she had asked him to move, not fully understanding the weight of her actions until it was too late. She could only imagine the thoughts running through his head as he silently complied, his calm demeanor betraying nothing of the internal tumult he might have been feeling. As she walked through the corridors of the airport, her steps grew more uncertain. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this wasn't a typical situation. She had the sinking feeling that this was more than just a small mistake to correct. It felt like a crossroads, a moment that might have far-reaching consequences she couldn't yet comprehend. She wasn't just trying to apologize to a passenger, she was trying to bridge a gap between two completely different worlds, her world and his. She thought about the man in 14B. Alexander Finch. The name still felt surreal, as though it didn't quite belong to the person she had met on the plane. The man had seemed so ordinary, so unassuming, dressed in casual clothes and blending seamlessly into the crowd. His demeanor had been calm, but his presence had been undeniable. There was something about him that had commanded respect without ever asking for it. He hadn't been flashy or ostentatious, he hadn't tried to impress anyone. And yet, now that she knew who he really was, Emily understood that he didn't need to. His quiet confidence, the way he had moved through the world with such grace and ease, made it clear that he was a person who didn't rely on the superficial trappings of wealth or power. He was his own man, operating on a level that was far beyond the ordinary. Emily's pace quickened as she approached the exit, scanning the crowd for any sign of him. She had no idea where he might have gone, whether he had already disappeared into the crowds or whether he was still somewhere nearby. She had no plan, no clear idea of how to find him, but she knew she had to try. She couldn't let this opportunity slip away. This wasn't just about apologizing, it was about understanding, about making things right. She had been given a glimpse into a world she hadn't fully appreciated before, and now, she wanted to learn more. She wanted to make sure that her actions hadn't forever tainted the possibility of connecting with someone who could change her life. The airport terminal was crowded, and the noise was almost deafening, people talking, announcements echoing overhead, the sound of rolling suitcases and the shuffle of footsteps. Emily weaved her way through the throngs of passengers, her eyes scanning the area in desperation. She had no idea where to start. She knew that he was someone who valued his privacy, someone who didn't want to be seen or recognized. But this was important. She had to find him. Just as she was about to give up, she caught sight of him standing near a cafe, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He was still dressed in the same black hoodie, his eyes focused on the screen of his phone. The sight of him, standing so casually among the crowd, was almost surreal. How could someone so powerful and influential blend in so seamlessly with the rest of the world? How could someone who held so much sway over industries and economies simply walk through the airport as if he were just another traveler? Emily stopped dead in her tracks, watching him for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Then, gathering every ounce of courage she had, she walked toward him. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last as she approached the man who had, without even knowing it, altered the course of her day, and perhaps her life. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but the closer she got, the more her nerves seemed to spike. She could see him now more clearly, the way he stood with quiet confidence, his posture relaxed but purposeful. The same man she had kicked off the plane was now standing before her, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the realization that he was every bit as remarkable as she had feared. When he saw her approach, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of recognition. For a brief moment, Emily wondered if he would simply walk away, if he would dismiss her entirely, but then he did something unexpected. He smiled, a warm, knowing smile that seemed to put her at ease, even though the weight of her mistake still loomed large in her mind. "Hello again," he said, his voice smooth and easy. "I didn't expect to see you here." Emily stopped in front of him, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Finch, I owe you an apology. I can't believe what I did earlier. I had no idea who you were, and I asked you to leave the plane. I've never made a mistake like that before. He held up his hand, cutting her off with a gentle but firm gesture. "It's all right," he said. "You were doing your job. I understand. You had no way of knowing who I was, and I didn't expect special treatment. Honestly, I was just glad to have a quiet flight." The simplicity of his words took Emily by surprise. Here she was, nervous and apologetic, ready to beg for his forgiveness, and he was acting as if nothing had happened. As if it were all a minor inconvenience, not a mistake that could have had serious consequences. His calmness only made her feel more out of place. She had expected him to be upset, maybe even offended. Instead, he was composed, gracious even, as though he had seen this kind of thing happen 1,000 times before. "Thank you for being so understanding," she said, her voice still shaky but grateful. I wanted to make sure I did the right thing. I was so focused on doing my job that I didn't think about who you were. And now, I realize how much I've overlooked." He gave her a slight nod, as though acknowledging her sincerity. "Don't be too hard on yourself. Like I said, it's not a big deal. But I can see you're someone who cares about what you do. That's important." Emily felt a flicker of relief wash over her at his words. "I do care," she said, her voice growing steadier. "I've always tried to treat every passenger with respect, no matter who they are. I never want to make anyone feel invisible. But I guess, sometimes, I forget that even the people who seem the most ordinary are often extraordinary in ways we can't see at first." Alexander smiled again, a knowing look in his eyes. "You're right. It's easy to forget. People like me, we've learned how to blend in, how to disappear into the background. But that doesn't mean we're any different from anyone else. At the end of the day, we all want the same thing, to be treated like human beings." The simplicity of his statement struck Emily deeply. She had spent so much of her life worrying about appearances, about making the right impression, that she had forgotten the fundamental truth that everyone, no matter their status, wanted to be seen for who they truly were. It wasn't the wealth or the power that mattered, it was the person beneath it all. For the first time, Emily felt like she was starting to understand something much bigger than the surface-level interactions that had dominated her world for so long. This man, this billionaire CEO, had taught her something invaluable in the space of just a few moments. It wasn't about the money, or the status, or the title, it was about the humanity that connected them all. "I'm glad I met you," Emily said, her voice steady now. "I've learned more in the past few hours than I could have imagined." Alexander's expression softened, and for a moment, it was as if he saw her for who she was, not just a flight attendant, but a person striving to do her best in a world full of complexity and uncertainty. "I think the world could use more people like you," he said quietly. "People who care, people who understand that our interactions with others have far more weight than we realize." Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she met his gaze, and for the first time that day, she felt like everything had fallen into place. It wasn't just about apologizing to him, it was about recognizing the deeper connections that tied them all together, connections that went beyond titles, beyond wealth, beyond status. It was a lesson she would carry with her forever, a reminder that sometimes, the most important thing we can do is simply see each other for who we really are. As she turned to leave, her heart light, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the man who had unknowingly given her a gift that would shape her future in ways she couldn't yet predict, but that she knew would be profound. And as she walked away, she realized that this wasn't just a mistake she had corrected, it was a lesson learned, one that would guide her through all the encounters to come.